And Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker joins me now. I mean, the state of Illinois, I don't have to tell you, but to remind everybody watching, has been on the front edge of Trump's targeting. And he is now, as you all know, threatening to bring the military into Minnesota against the governor and local leaders' wishes. Today, he said he thinks a town looks better with the military on the streets. I know you watch all of this closely because what happens to one state could happen to another. Have you thought about this kind of scenario and how you would respond if Trump tried to do that in your state? I know we had the National Guard, but this is a next level here.
Well, I want to credit, first of all, the people of Illinois, the people of Chicago, for having helped us develop the playbook about how to deal with the onslaught from the federal government. We, of course, encouraged people to peacefully protest, and they did. We encourage people to speak up and speak out because it matters if we're being loud in favor of democracy and pushing back. And importantly, we've taken them to court, from the very, very beginning when they were talking about bringing the National Guard, or at least federalizing, bring them into our cities. We immediately went to court. And on every issue throughout the first year in office for Donald Trump, we have at every turn pushed back, taken them to court. And frankly, we've won most of those cases. And so I feel good about at least the judiciary is holding up in this time of, challenges to democracy. I want to also add, though, that, what's really affecting people's lives on a daily basis, and I don't want to discount what's happening on the streets in neighborhoods where people are being attacked by ICE and CBP, but remember that other people who are not directly affected by that, their lives have been made worse. The promises that Donald Trump made about lowering prices, about affordability, about making people's lives better, all of them were lies. And over again, we've seen this administration not only fail to live up to their promises, but persistently, when they're challenged, they lie. And I want to say that about ICE and CBP and DHS. Tricia McLaughlin, who's their spokesperson, consistently lies, doesn't have any facts, will come out with statements a half an hour after an incident when she doesn't really have any information. They're just making things up so that the public will think, oh, everything's just fine, when they're shooting moms in the face. I mean, this is the American public are beginning to see that this administration is a danger to their futures.
No question about it. And I think what we're all watching here, I started the show talking a bit about how Governor Walz is in this position where he has put the National Guard on alert. And just in case the president of the United States sends in the military, an Army battalion, into the state of Minnesota. And I just wonder what you think about that dynamic, whether it is the U.S. men and women who are serving in the National Guard or in the Army battalion, or just how to manage that as a governor where you have troops who are on different sides, essentially, of deployment.
He's fomenting this kind of clash that is on its way. Donald Trump thinks that it's okay to call in the military to declare the Insurrection Act, even when it's just about people peacefully protesting. Because, as you heard him say, he thinks it's better if there are troops on the streets of American cities. And we know, by the way, that this has nothing to do, in his mind, with how it looks. What he wants is ultimately to control American cities because he wants to affect the elections in 2026, because he knows he's going to lose if he doesn't do that. And deploying troops, and I mean including CBP and ICE, deploying people who are wearing uniforms and carrying automatic weapons, this is going to intimidate people who want to go vote. And he may very well try to carry out what Michael Flynn said back in 2020 that Donald Trump ought to do, which is seize the ballot boxes so he can count the votes because, there's fraud in the election. Look, they're just making things up at this point. The brave men and women of our armed forces, the brave men and women of our National Guard are being used as pawns, political pawns, by this president.
No question about that. I think they're put in an incredibly untenable position. Let me ask you something. We're in 2026 now, as you fully know, and you have been warning about what Trump is trying to do with the ballot boxes and just basically to make it harder to vote. I heard an interview this morning from one of your fellow governors, Gretchen Whitmer, and she said that she expects further efforts from pro-Trump figures to disrupt voting in her state, something you've been saying for a while, saying even that it is not paranoid to think that the Trump administration will use DHS to interfere with the elections. I know you've been expressing concern about this. She referenced how governors have been talking about this. I assume you've been a part of that. What are you all talking about? How are you preparing for it? Because I think you and others have been warning people about it, and now people are wondering, what are we going to do about it?
Well, the question is, how do we monitor the polling places? How do we make sure that we're actually clearing out the interference that Donald Trump is trying to bring to our elections? And we've been talking, I don't want to talk fully about, all the things that we've been working on, but let's just say that, traditionally in elections, when you're concerned about whether it's going to be a fair election or not, and there have been concerns before had nothing to do with National Guard or Donald Trump or troops. But traditionally in an election, you have monitors. You have people who show up and, they're poll watchers, right, who are maybe in contact with a state's attorney or a prosecutor who can come in and make sure that things are happening in a fair way. Well, imagine that on steroids, and that's really what we're talking about. Imagine that we've got to protect our ballot boxes and protect our voting booths and protect those polling places, and how we might do that. Look, in the end, what we don't want, the last thing that any of us want, is an armed confrontation between, let's say, our National Guard or our state police and federal troops or federal ICE and CBP. So we're looking at ways to try to manage through this very difficult situation and avoid those confrontations, because that would be just disastrous.
And today we learned, and I'm sure you saw this, that the Department of Justice has subpoenaed the offices of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, and several other local and state officials. It wasn't really too long ago when Trump said that you and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson should be arrested. I remember very clearly you basically said, "Come get me," or some version of that. So that was an effective pushback. But it feels like it is now escalated again, where the Department of Justice issuing subpoenas makes it it puts a little bit more legal meat on it, I suppose. Have you thought about this? If you are a favorite target of Trump, if you and other officials in Illinois are subpoenaed by the Department of Justice, how you would handle that?
Look, this is the world we're living in, where Tim Walz and Jacob Frey are being targeted, where I'm being targeted by the President of the United States for just doing our jobs. Yeah. And that attack that he's bringing is one where, my response, and I know Tim Walz's response is, come and get us, because everything you're saying is a lie. And you cannot cower in the face of Donald Trump. He is a classic bully. You can't step back. You can't get back on your heels. You got to stay forward on these things and fight back. And the American public sees that it's BS, what Donald Trump is trying to do to his political opponents. He tried to take away child care from 5 blue states. Why? Because the governors are his political opponents. He is taking away food assistance and health care. And, the American public is not going to stand for this. And indeed, we're going to see it in the 2026 elections. And I believe that the law and the power of the courts allows us finally, because we understand that they are going to stand on our side, to push back. And I'm not suggesting that the Supreme Court is exactly the way we'd want them to be, and they certainly have made some bad decisions. But in general, the court system has stood on our side. And so we've got to use that as well as the power of the people. People power in the end here is what's going to win this the day. And Donald Trump is afraid. When he sees his numbers falling, you can hear him start to soften his tone and express concern that, he's just not as popular as he used to be and doesn't understand why. And so I really believe that we're having the intended effect here. But look, the attack by the Justice Department on us as individuals, as elected leaders, we have to recognize that when they're going after turning this country into an authoritarian regime, that the only thing you can do is every single day push back, because every day that you're not pushing back, they're advancing their cause and making us weaker. So we've got to push back, and again, everybody peacefully, but you can't go a day without saying something or making sure that you're protecting the people that you represent.
The other piece that, just as it relates to the law and how they're using the legal system, I mean, over the weekend, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche said the Justice Department is not investigating the ICE officer who shot Renee Good in Minneapolis. And as you well know, I mean, the Minnesota State Attorney General and the Hennepin County District Attorney have launched their own investigation, something that would happen, of course, in other states. But normally, as you all know, the states would work with the FBI. And right now, the FBI is also not giving them access to information gathered at the crime scene. I know you've thought about this because you also signed an executive order back in October creating a database to basically track the unlawful actions by federal immigration officers in Illinois. It feels very pertinent today. What do you think? What do you do when the federal government is essentially obstructing justice at the state level like this? You have your database, but what can you do to hold people like this officer and others to account at this point?
First of all, it's more than a database. We created something called the Illinois Accountability Commission. It's headed by retired federal judges who are gathering testimony, including video, including, as you said, a database of all the information that we have. Why? Because we are going to hold them accountable. And yes, it's true. When Trump and J.D. Vance are saying that these federal officers have absolute immunity, they do not. But they do if the president is going to pardon them or not hold them accountable while he's president. You know what? He's not going to be president forever. And having the information in order to come after those people, to make sure that they are held accountable when the time comes. I know it's not good enough. I'd like to be able to hold them accountable today, but it is true that the Supremacy Clause makes that very difficult for states. So we're gathering the information because in 2029, in January, Gregory Bavino is going to have to answer for his actions. Kristi Noem, Tom Homan, and frankly, the line officers that are abusing people and in some cases shooting people in the face, they're going to be held accountable one way or another when this administration goes away.